The call came at exactly 2 a.m. I have spent 40 years in construction, trained to listen to the subtle shifts of settling foundations and the groans of stressed steel, but nothing could have prepared me for the sound of my daughter's voice at that hour. It was not the voice of the composed, professional pediatric nurse I had raised. It was a fragmented, trembling whisper that seemed to vanish into the static of the line. "Dad, please," Sophie gasped, her words slurring together as if she were fighting an invisible, paralyzing weight. "I need you to come get me. They won't let me leave." The raw, unadulterated terror in her tone froze the blood in my veins. Before I could even demand an explanation or force her to tell me who they were, there was a sharp, dull thud, followed by the sound of a device hitting the floor and a sudden, oppressive silence. I did not waste a single second in hesitation. My instincts as a master builder took over, bypassing the shock of the moment and moving straight into a state of methodical, calculated action. On a job site, when a structural alarm sounds, you do not pause to debate the cause. You act to secure the perimeter and save the foundation. I threw off the blankets, grabbed my heavy winter coat, and stepped into the biting cold of the Sydney night. I unlocked my safe, securing the necessary tools I might need to gain entry, and climbed into my Uda. The drive toward Mossman was a blur of empty, frost-covered streets and streetlights that blurred into long, flickering streaks. My mind, usually a bastion of logic and architectural blueprints, was a storm of dark scenarios. Sophie was the most responsible, level-headed person I knew. If she was incoherent and terrified, it meant the foundation of her life had been violently compromised. At 2:45 a.m., my headlights swept across the imposing iron gates of the St. Clair estate. The mansion, a sprawling, cold monument to old money and carefully curated reputations, sat in absolute darkness, save for one dim light flickering on the second floor. I did not bother with the intercom. I parked the Uda directly in front of the massive double doors, stepped out into the freezing air, and hammered against the solid oak with the force of a man prepared to dismantle the entire structure brick by brick. A few moments later, the heavy door swung open, and Margot St. Clair stood there. She was not disheveled or confused by the middle-of-the-night disturbance. She was fully dressed in a tailored silk blouse, her hair immaculately styled. She had been awake, waiting. "Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with a cold, calculated arrogance that suggested she viewed me as nothing more than a structural nuisance. "Sophie is having a severe medical episode. She is not leaving this house." I stared at her, the stench of a premeditated lie suffocating the air between us. I did not ask for permission. I simply stepped forward, using my broad shoulders to exert the leverage required to push past her. The game had begun, and I had no intention of losing. Margot staggered back against the foyer wall, her face twisting from calculated indifference into a mask of sharp, indignant fury. She reached out, trying to physically block my path with a desperation that only confirmed my darkest suspicions. "You have no right to barge into my home like a common laborer, Arthur," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a shrill, elitist entitlement. I did not dignify her outburst with a response. I looked past her at the grand, sweeping staircase that led to the second floor. The architecture of this house was designed to intimidate, but to me, it was nothing more than a collection of load-bearing walls and hollow spaces that I could dismantle if necessary. I ignored her protests, my boots heavy and deliberate against the polished marble floor as I moved toward the stairs. I took the steps two at a time, my aging joints protesting, but my resolve remaining unyielding. The silence of the upper hallway was absolute, broken only by the frantic sound of my own breathing and Margot's shrill, echoing demands behind me. I reached the master suite, the only room with a light burning, and found the door locked from the inside. I did not waste time with the handle. 30 years of swinging sledgehammers and kicking down reinforced drywall had taught me the exact point of structural failure on any doorway. I raised my heavy work boot and drove it with precision into the wood just below the handle. The timber splintered instantly. The lock gave way with a sharp, violent crack, and the door swung wide open. What I saw inside turned my pulse into a cold, rhythmic hammer against my ribs. The room was a scene of calculated chaos. Expensive designer lamps were overturned, and the silk bedding had been stripped and thrown to the floor. In the center of the room, lying completely motionless on the cold timber floor, was my daughter. Sophie was curled into a defensive posture, her breathing shallow and dangerously irregular. I dropped to my knees beside her, my hands hovering over her as I fought to control my own tremors. When I turned her arm to check for a pulse, I saw them, dark, deep-set finger-shaped bruises wrapping around her pale skin. These were not the marks of a simple stumble. They were the undeniable, chilling evidence of someone having pinned her down with sustained, brutal force. The cold, mechanical logic of my professional life told me everything I needed to know. This was not a medical episode. This was a crime scene. I gathered Sophie into my arms, her body unnervingly limp, and stood up, ready to walk through fire to get her out of this gilded cage. Before I could even adjust my grip on Sophie, the shadow of Lachlan St. Clair fell across the doorway. He stood there, perfectly poised, wearing silk pajamas that were devoid of any wrinkles. For a man who had supposedly been jolted from a deep sleep by a violent domestic crisis, his composure was a structural failure that I spotted instantly. His hair was perfectly styled, and his breathing was as steady as a calm sea. He didn't rush to his wife's side. Instead, he stood back, his eyes darting from the splintered door frame to my face, attempting to recalibrate his expression into one of manufactured shock. It was a performance so hollow that it grated on my nerves like grinding metal. "Arthur, please," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of true panic. "You are making a grave mistake. She has been completely hysterical for hours. We were trying to manage a delicate psychiatric break without drawing public attention." He moved forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture, but his eyes were cold, devoid of the raw, desperate concern a husband should feel for a dying partner. I stood up, cradling Sophie against my chest. Her weightless form felt like a direct indictment of his negligence. I looked at the dark, distinct bruises on her arms, the precise pressure points of someone holding her down while she struggled for breath, and then back to Lachlan's unruffled face. The narrative he was trying to sell was rotting from the inside out, a structure built on cheap, fraudulent materials that I had spent my entire career learning how to deconstruct. "She is not having a break," I said, my voice low and vibrating with a deadly, controlled intensity that stopped him in his tracks. "She has been restrained. This isn't a medical episode. This is an assault." Lachlan flickered, his mask slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal a flash of unfiltered, venomous irritation. He attempted to step closer, his tone turning authoritative. "You are not thinking rationally, Arthur. If you involve emergency services, they will place her on a permanent, involuntary psychiatric hold. It will destroy her career and our reputation. My mother has already contacted our private physician. He is arriving shortly to handle this privately and discreetly." I stared at him, unable to fathom the level of arrogance required to prioritize a public reputation over the life of a human being. He was worried about the foundation of his social standing, oblivious to the fact that I was already bringing his entire world crashing down. I stepped past him, my presence alone forcing him to stumble back against the wall. I wouldn't let their private physician or their carefully curated lies touch my daughter ever again. I did not wait for his permission or for their private physician to arrive. I carried Sophie down the grand staircase, my boots thudding against the marble with a rhythm that felt like a death knell for their carefully constructed narrative. Margot stood at the base of the stairs, her expression hardening into a look of absolute, icy defiance. She didn't move to help. She simply raised her chin, her eyes tracking our progress with the cold detachment of an architect surveying a failed project. As I reached the front door, Lachlan descended rapidly behind me, his veneer of professional calm finally beginning to fracture into thin, jagged lines of panic. "You are making a catastrophic error, Arthur," he warned, his voice straining to maintain its authority. "If you take her to a public hospital, you will lose all control over her treatment. We have the legal authority here." I am her husband, and I hold her enduring power of attorney. His words hit me with the weight of a physical blow, but I didn't stop. I kicked the front door wide open, the cold night air rushing in to meet the suffocating atmosphere of the mansion. I maneuvered Sophie into the passenger seat of my Uda, wrapping my heavy work coat around her to shield her from the biting wind. I secured her with the seatbelt with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the boiling, tectonic rage inside me. Just as I slammed the door and moved to the driver's side, Lachlan scrambled out, his face flushed with a desperate, frantic energy. He lunged toward the vehicle, trying to grab the handle, his voice cracking with a mix of entitlement and fear. "She stays here. You cannot legally remove her from my care. I have the documents to prove she is incompetent, and you're currently trespassing on private property." I stared at him through the glass, seeing not a husband, but a panicked animal trapped in the corner of his own design. I didn't engage in a debate. I simply started the engine. The roar of the Uda's motor drowned out his shrill protests as I slammed it into gear and tore down the long, winding driveway. I didn't look back at the iron gates or the shadowy figures of the street clears. I drove toward the lights of the Royal North Shore Hospital, my mind already dissecting the legal trap they had set. Lachlan thought his power of attorney was a steel beam that would keep me from my daughter, but he had forgotten one critical detail of the construction trade. Every structure, no matter how reinforced, has a hidden flaw if you know where to look. He had played his hand, thinking the law was his fortress, but he had only succeeded in giving me a clear view of exactly where to strike. The drive to the hospital was a blur of high-speed maneuvers and agonizing silence. Sophie remained limp beside me, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches that sent jolts of pure adrenaline through my nervous system. Upon our arrival at the emergency department, I carried her through the automatic glass doors, shouting for immediate triage. The staff, recognizing the severity of the situation, mobilized instantly. I was pushed back into the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting area, forced to watch from a distance as a team of nurses and doctors swarmed around her. My body was still, but my mind was operating with the relentless, analytical precision of a master builder surveying a compromised site. I sat on a hard plastic chair, leaning my elbows on my knees, and let the facts settle into a coherent pattern. When you spend your life reading blueprints, you develop an intuitive ability to spot the hairline fractures, those tiny, almost invisible cracks in a slab that indicate the entire foundation is shifting. Everything Lachlan and Margot had said was a facade, but a facade always leaves a trail. The emergency room doctor, a man named Harrison, emerged from the trauma bay with a sterile, professional mask. He walked straight toward me, but he didn't address me with the transparency a medical professional should. Instead, his gaze was guarded, shifting nervously as he recited the same script Lachlan had prepared: acute psychiatric distress, self-medication, and a critical overdose of anxiety suppressants and alcohol. I listened to his words, but I wasn't hearing a diagnosis. I was hearing a fabrication. The memory hit me with the force of a falling beam. When Sophie was 18, she had taken one sip of a red wine at a family celebration, only to suffer a violent anaphylactic reaction. The doctors back then were clear: she had a severe, lifelong allergy to sulfites. It was a fact etched into her medical history, a permanent structural constraint of her health. Sophie was a brilliant, highly disciplined pediatric nurse. She knew better than anyone the chemical dangers she faced. She would never, under any circumstances, drink a bottle of wine. It was a death sentence she would have recognized instantly. The realization flooded my veins with a cold, terrifying clarity. Lachlan's story about the wine and the pills wasn't just a lie. It was a physical impossibility. The foundation of his narrative was not just flawed. It was completely fraudulent. If she hadn't consumed the wine, then the toxic cocktail Harrison was describing couldn't have been a suicide attempt. It meant the ingredients of the medical report were as manufactured as the bruises on her arms. Someone had forced those substances into her system, and they had relied on the assumption that I, a man they considered an ignorant laborer, would never bother to look at the structural integrity of their story. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They had built their trap on a base of sand, and I was finally starting to see the cracks. I sat in the cold, sterile waiting area, the harsh hospital light reflecting off my weathered hands. My instincts as a master builder were screaming a single, logical truth. A structure built on a lie is designed to collapse. I realized then that if I charged the gates of their reality with raw fury, I would only be playing into the hands of a man like Lachlan St. Clair. He wanted me to act like an unhinged, grieving father. He wanted me to make a scene so he could validate his narrative of my instability and seal my daughter's fate behind the locked doors of his private clinic. To save Sophie, I had to stop acting like a victim of their circumstances and start operating as the one person who knew exactly how their house was built. I needed to move with the same caution one uses when dismantling an unstable high-rise. If I made a wrong move, the entire project, and Sophie's life, would come crashing down on top of me. I pulled out my phone, my fingers steady despite the internal tremor of rage. I wasn't just looking for a lawyer. I was looking for a demolition expert. I needed to find a way to freeze the St. Clair Foundation before they could extract a single cent from Sophie's trust or permanently silence her mind. My wife, Sarah, had been a woman of profound foresight. She had placed that money in an ironclad trust, specifically designed to protect Sophie from the kind of opportunistic vultures who orbit wealth. The documents were stored in a high-security safe at my home, a piece of engineering I had personally cast in reinforced concrete. I knew the access codes by heart, but more importantly, I knew the legal conditions attached to them. Sophie had reached full maturity exactly 2 weeks ago. The timing was not a coincidence. In the construction business, there are no coincidences, only patterns that have been ignored. Lachlan hadn't been a devoted husband for 3 years. He had been a predatory investor waiting for a window of liquidity. He hadn't just targeted Sophie. He had targeted an asset. Every movement he made, the controlled isolation, the manufactured psychiatric crisis, the urgency of the power of attorney, was a tactical maneuver to gain control of her inheritance. He wasn't trying to heal her. He was trying to liquidate her. I stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the hospital linoleum. I didn't need to shout to be heard, and I didn't need to beg for permission. I walked out of the hospital, my posture rigid, my mind finally locked into a plan of systematic destruction. I was no longer a man reacting to a tragedy. I was an architect preparing for a demolition. I had the blueprints to their deception, and I was going to tear every single one of their walls down, starting from the foundation up. They had underestimated the quiet, methodical nature of a man who spent a lifetime ensuring that nothing he ever built would crumble. They had made the mistake of thinking I was broken, when in reality, I was just beginning to construct my response. I returned to my home, the silence inside the house heavy and suffocating, yet no longer felt like a void. It felt like a workspace. I headed straight to my private study, a room lined with the remnants of a career built on precise measurements and heavy lifting. I knelt on the worn rug, pulled back the heavy wool runner, and revealed the cold, steel dial of my floor safe. The rhythmic metallic clicks, 34 right, 12 left, 58 right, grounded my racing thoughts. With a definitive thud, the locking bolts retracted, and I reached into the cavity, pulling out the heavy manila envelope that contained the full financial blueprint Sarah had left behind. As I laid the documents across the mahogany desk, the harsh desk lamp illuminated the numbers that confirmed my worst fears. Sarah's trust fund for Sophie had grown to $8 million, all of it maturing precisely 14 days ago. But the real discovery came when I powered on my phone. A small, red notification icon blinked on the screen, a missed voicemail from 3 days ago, left at a time when I had been working in the garage with my power tools. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the static resolve into Sophie's voice. She didn't sound sedated or hysterical. She sounded sharp, alert, and terrifyingly frightened. "Dad, it is me," she whispered, her words clipped by the sound of a door clicking shut in the background. I found bank statements in Lachlan's briefcase. He is bankrupt. He has been forging my signature on loan applications to cover his losses, and this morning he demanded I transfer my trust fund into a joint account. When I refused, he threatened me. I'm going to call Mitchell and file for financial separation, but I am scared. Please, find Mom's original documents. I need to prove that money is mine. The recording ended with a sharp, chilling beep. Standing in the darkness of my study, the entire puzzle locked into place with a terrifying, mechanical finality. Sophie hadn't suffered a mental collapse. She had discovered Lachlan's embezzlement and refused to be his lifeline to federal prison. Her resistance had transformed her into a liability, and the Street Clairs had responded by initiating a hostile, medically induced takeover. They weren't just gaslighting her. They were attempting to institutionalize her so Lachlan could legally seize her inheritance before the auditors arrived. The rage that had been a dull, throbbing weight in my chest suddenly sharpened into a cold, lethal clarity. They wanted to tear down my daughter's life for a payout, but they had forgotten that I was the one who taught them how to build. I wasn't going to just defend Sophie. I was going to systematically deconstruct every aspect of their hollow, fraudulent existence. The hunt required a shift in methodology. I could no longer act as a grieving father, but rather as an operative infiltrating a hostile site. I spent the afternoon at a commercial supply depot, acquiring the specialized tools necessary for a professional assessment. I purchased a high-definition fiber optic inspection camera, a signal jammer to neutralize their cellular backup, and a set of tactical bypass tools. By the time the sun dipped below the Sydney skyline, I had retreated to a nondescript motel in the outer suburbs. I dressed in dark, tactical clothing, my movements fluid and efficient as I prepared for the silent work ahead. Lachlan and Margot were scheduled to attend a charity gala at the Crown, leaving the St. Clair estate vulnerable. It was the exact window of opportunity one needed to expose the rot in their foundation. I approached the estate from the eastern perimeter, navigating the thick vegetation with the silence of a man who knew every stone of the property. 5 years prior, I had personally overseen the renovation of this mansion. I knew its structural vulnerabilities, its motion sensor zones, and its hardwired fail-safes better than anyone. I bypassed the main gates and moved to the utility panel hidden behind a dense row of evergreens. With practiced precision, I severed the primary fiber optic line and deployed my signal jammer, rendering the estate security system blind and deaf. I used a tactical crowbar to bypass the deadbolt on the kitchen door, stepping into the cool, silent interior with the grace of a ghost. I moved first to Margot's private parlor. I climbed onto a velvet chair and carefully unscrewed the metal grating of the HVAC vent, planting the fiber optic camera inside. It was a surgical placement, angled to capture the entire room without leaving a single trace of my presence. From there, I crept toward the belly of the beast, Lachlan's home office. The air inside the room was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the cold, sharp tang of corporate greed. I repeated the procedure, installing a second microlens directly above his mahogany desk. Now, every document he signed and every desperate phone call he made would be recorded. The final piece of the operation was the most dangerous. I reached into my bag and produced a specialized industrial USB cloning drive. I plugged it into the hidden port at the back of his desktop tower. A small, pulsing blue light illuminated the dark corner, signaling the start of the data extraction. I stood in the absolute silence of the office, counting the seconds as the progress bar crawled forward. Every creak of the old house, settling, sounded like a warning, but I remained motionless, my eyes locked on the digital display. At 98%, a metallic click echoed from the foyer. The deadbolt was turning. They had returned early. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained steady. I pulled the drive the instant it flashed green, slid through the office window, and dropped onto the steel scaffolding of the roof repair project outside. I had the secrets that would bring their empire to its knees. The structural collapse of the St. Clair family had officially begun. By 9 o'clock the following morning, I stood in the lobby of the gleaming glass tower that housed St. Clair Financial. The building was an architectural marvel designed to project an image of absolute transparency and immense wealth. But I knew better. High-rise structures with the most glass often concealed the deepest, darkest basements. I adjusted my posture, letting my shoulders slump and my eyes grow dim, adopting the persona of the exhausted, grieving father. I approached the receptionist with a heavy sigh, clutching a manila folder filled with mundane childhood medical records, the perfect, unremarkable prop for my visit. "Excuse me," I said, my voice rasping just enough to sound fragile. "I'm Arthur Sterling, Lachlan's father-in-law. I know I lack an appointment, but I have some urgent medical forms the clinic requires for Sophie. I hope to catch him before he disappeared into meetings." The receptionist's expression softened into an immediate, patronizing sympathy. She was a cog in Lachlan's polish machine, and she fell for the performance instantly. After a brief internal call, she gestured toward the executive suite. "Mr. St. Clair is devastated, but he will see you, Arthur. Please follow me." I walked down the walnut-paneled hallway, my footsteps absorbed by the thick carpet. As I reached the final door, I noticed it was left ajar by a fraction of an inch. I didn't announce my arrival. Instead, I pressed my back flat against the wall, holding my breath as the sound from within confirmed my deepest suspicions. Inside, Lachlan was not mourning. He was screaming. "I do not care what you tell the auditors," he hissed, his voice trembling with a manic, violent energy that shattered his public image. "You move that capital by the end of the day. If those margin calls hit my desk tomorrow, we are finished. Bury the deficit under the shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. I need 72 hours, or I am heading to a federal prison for embezzling client funds." I watched through the narrow opening. Margot was there, pacing the floor like a predator circling a cage. "Get a hold of yourself, Lachlan," she snapped, her tone dripping with icy disdain. "Sophie's trust fund is the only asset that can cover this deficit. Once the judge signs the emergency guardianship on Friday, we seize the $8 million, silence the federal auditors, and wash our hands of this mess. Just keep her sedated until the paperwork is finalized." My blood turned to ice. They were casually discussing the permanent destruction of my daughter's mind to cover their corporate fraud. They intended to leave her a vegetable in their private facility while they plundered her inheritance. I wanted to kick the mahogany door off its hinges and silence them forever, but that would only forfeit the game. I needed to destroy them legally, within the ironclad structure of the law. Suddenly, the leather chair squeaked, signaling movement toward the door. I quickly stepped back, dropping the manila folder to the floor, and assumed the position of a broken, confused old man. As the door swung wide, Lachlan stood in the threshold, his face flushed and sweating. He froze, his eyes darting from me to the floor, searching for any sign of deception. Finding nothing but the image of a grieving, clumsy father, his panic dissolved into a patronizing sneer. He adjusted his tie, regained his composure, and offered a false, hollow smile. "Arthur," he said, his voice dripping with insincere warmth, "I'm glad you are finally being reasonable. Come inside. Let us talk about Sophie's recovery." I stood up slowly, clutching the papers to my chest, my furnace-like rage buried deep beneath a mask of absolute, calculated submission. The roadside cafe on the outskirts of Sydney smelled of roasted coffee and grease, a stark, gritty contrast to the polished marble and corporate vanity of Lachlan's office. I sat in a secluded, stained vinyl booth in the back, nursing a black coffee that was as bitter as the reality we were uncovering. Across from me sat Mitchell, a ruthless financial attorney who saw corporate fraud not as a crime, but as a structural collapse, and Leon, a retired detective whose eyes never stopped scanning the room, dissecting every patron's movement. I laid out the entire sequence. The forged medical reports, the sulfite allergy discrepancy, and the raw, unadulterated confession I had overheard in the office. I told them about the private transport van and the illegal incarceration of my daughter in a facility owned by Margot St. Clair herself. Mitchell remained silent for a long time, his brow furrowed as he reviewed the legal landscape. If Lachlan holds a valid enduring power of attorney and Sophie signed it while lucid, we are blocked on the standard legal front, he explained, his voice low and devoid of professional polish. If we approach the police prematurely, they will simply wave those documents in their faces. The authorities rarely intervene in what appears to be a private, domestic medical dispute. They have built an airtight legal fortress, Arthur. They can keep her sedated, transition her to a long-term care facility, and wait until Friday to finalize the conservatorship. We cannot hit them head-on. Leon nodded, his expression grim. He is right. If you force a wellness check, their legal team will bury you under a restraining order. They are waiting for you to make a scene so they can label you as an erratic, dangerous father. I leaned over the table, my voice dropping to a register of absolute, cold determination. I don't want to attack their gate, Mitchell. I want to freeze their foundation. I need you to lock that trust fund so tight that Lachlan cannot extract a single cent. Mitchell sighed, tapping his pen against the laminated table. I can file an injunction based on the suspicion of coercion, but I need proof of his financial distress to justify a freeze. If I tip our hand before the courts open on Friday, they will counterfile and drag this through litigation for years. I turned to Leon, who is already running calculations on his tablet, and I need to know exactly where they are holding her. Silver Pines is just one of many facilities under their corporate umbrella. We must find her physical location before Friday, or they will move her again. I stood up, leaving the men to their work, and walked out into the cool, biting air. I knew what I had to do next. I pulled out my phone and dialed Lachlan's number. I carefully modulated my voice, forcing it to sound thin, trembling, and utterly defeated, a man who had finally surrendered to the weight of his grief. When he answered, the arrogance in his voice was palpable, a predator already tasting the kill. I told him I was finished, that I was packing my gear to head up to a remote fishing cabin in the snowy mountains, a place with no cell service and no hope of return. I let the silence hang, long and heavy, until I heard the relief in his tone. He believed he had won. He believed I was driving 5 hours south to sit by a lake and fade away. As I ended the call, I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat of my Uda and turned the key. I wasn't driving south. I was heading into the industrial heart of the city to gather the final set of tools. The demolition of the St. Clair Empire had officially entered its terminal phase. The abandoned warehouse in Sydney's industrial district had been transformed into a synchronized tactical command center. The air was heavy with the scent of bitter coffee and the electric hum of multiple processors working at peak capacity. Mitchell, his silk tie loosened and sleeves rolled up, sat hunched over a mountain of printed financial ledgers, while Leon remained glued to an encrypted monitor, managing digital backchannels. I stood in the center of the room, my focus entirely on the USB drive I had retrieved from Lachlan's office. It was a digital map of a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. Leon snatched the drive, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he executed a series of bypass codes to penetrate the residual security firewalls Lachlan had installed. The room fell into an agonizing silence, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of keys and the persistent, low-frequency drone of the server. When the decryption software finally hit 100%, a master directory of hidden files flooded the display. Mitchell leaned forward, his face paling as he scrolled through the data. "This isn't just an investment firm," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of professional awe and disgust. "This is a sophisticated, highly orchestrated Ponzi scheme." He pointed to a nested folder labeled Cayman Holdings. Lachlan had not been a successful financier for years. He had been actively cannibalizing his clients' portfolios, skimming millions through a labyrinth of shell companies to sustain the St. Clair lifestyle. As Mitchell delved deeper, he pulled up frantic, desperate internal memos, frantic correspondence with a chief financial officer documenting the impending collapse. The Securities and Exchange Commission had already flagged massive discrepancies in their filings, and a specialized task force from the Australian Federal Police had been quietly circling the firm for months. The walls of Lachlan's house of cards were not just cracking, they were disintegrating. Leon then accessed a hidden partition on the hard drive, a secure folder disguised as system cache. "Look at this," he muttered, pointing to a file marked for permanent deletion. It was a voice-activated dictation file from 3 days ago, the exact moment Sophie had confronted Lachlan. Leon clicked play, and the warehouse filled with the sound of glass shattering against a hardwood floor. Sophie's voice echoed through the speakers, fierce and unyielding. "I am not signing anything. I know exactly what you did to those clients. You stole millions, and you expect me to drain my mother's trust to save you from prison." Lachlan's response was a chilling contrast, a venomous, lethal hiss. "You are going to sit down and sign the forms, or I swear you will never leave this house." The scuffle that followed, the sickening sound of a body being shoved against a wall, ripped through me like a physical blade. Sophie had stood her ground. She had fought back against his manipulation until he forced the overdose upon her. The recording cut off abruptly, leaving a void of silence in the warehouse. I reached for my tactical crowbar, my jaw set like stone. I finally had the full, catastrophic blueprint of their attempted murder. The financial fraud was enough to ruin them, but the audio was a death warrant for their freedom. I turned toward the exit, my resolve absolute. I had all the evidence necessary to destroy their wealth and their standing. Now, it was time to tear down the walls of their medical prison and bring my daughter home. The final morning arrived with a cold, piercing clarity. At 9 a.m., the private judicial chamber of the Sydney District Court was filled with an atmosphere of manufactured, suffocating grief. Judge Thomas Aries sat behind the mahogany bench, his expression heavy with judicial gravity. Before him, Lachlan and Margot St. Clair deliver performance of terrifying precision. They were dressed in austere, muted tones, their heads bowed in synchronized sorrow. "Your Honor," Lachlan began, his voice cracking with rehearsed devastation. "We have tried to save Sophie from her own self-destructive impulses, but the chemical dependency has completely shattered her cognitive function. This emergency guardianship is the only way to ensure she does not succeed in ending her life." He presented the falsified medical records and the tainted toxicology reports, his posture projecting the image of a husband pushed to his absolute breaking point. Judge Aries reached for his pen, ready to sign the order that would grant Lachlan absolute control over Sophie's existence and her $8 million inheritance. At that moment, the heavy oak doors swung open. I stepped across the threshold, my stride steady and deliberate, flanked by Mitchell and Leon. Behind us, 2 stern-faced Australian federal police agents followed, their presence an immediate, jarring dissonance in the quiet courtroom. Lachlan froze, his tissue dropping from his hands, the mask of the devastated husband slipping to reveal the raw, trembling face of a man who realized his sanctuary had been breached. Margot lunged to her feet, her composure vanishing into a shrill, frantic screech. "You cannot allow this. This is a private medical hearing, and this man is a violent, unstable intruder." I did not raise my voice, but the weight of my words silenced the entire room. "Your Honor, I am Arthur Sterling. I am here to expose a premeditated kidnapping, a calculated poisoning, and a $12 million federal fraud." Mitchell stepped forward, placing a thick leather-bound volume on the judge's bench. It contained the independent toxicology findings, proving Sophie had been poisoned with flunitrazepam, not self-medicated, and the raw audio file of the Street Clairs discussing their plan to turn my daughter into a vegetable for financial gain. I plugged my device into the court's audio system, and as the recording played, Margot's chilling admission of how she held Sophie down while Lachlan forced the poison down her throat. The courtroom turned deadly silent. Judge Aries's face hardened into a mask of pure, judicial fury. "This court," he stated, his voice booming, "has never witnessed such profound malice. The emergency proxy is hereby revoked. The bailiffs are to take these defendants into immediate custody." Before Lachlan could utter a word of defense, the federal police agent stepped forward. The sharp click of steel handcuffs echoed through the chamber as they were hauled toward the exit, their screams of mutual recrimination. Lachlan blaming Margot's cruelty, Margot cursing Lachlan's incompetence, drowning in the marble halls. I didn't gloat. I turned immediately toward the door. With a federal warrant in hand, we drove straight to the Dandenong Ranges Clinic. The facility, designed to be a fortress of shadows, fell in minutes to the precision of the federal team. I found Sophie in room 412, her pale skin translucent, her eyes unfocused as she struggled against the lingering chemical fog. As I fell to my knees beside her, she recognized me, a faint, fragile warmth returning to her eyes. "I have you, Sophie," I whispered, tears finally breaking through my resolve. "We're going home." The long, dark demolition was over. The structure of their empire was ash, and my daughter was finally free.